Okay, thank you. Do the spotlight, yeah. Thank you so much, Ari. It's wonderful to be here again with all of you lovely people. And we're all doing so much of this learning online now. It's become a kind of a whole new culture. But please God, we'll be able to go out into the sunlight very soon. But we'll keep learning. And yes, and Barry, if you ever come to London, I'll take you around the British Museum myself. And that goes for all of you as well. Just look me up and we can go and see it in person. But it's a great privilege to be able to take you around, and we'll see how much we can cover in the time. And at the end, as I mentioned, I'll mention some of the programming that I'm doing with my college as well, which is online, which might interest you as well. So let me take you straight away to the entrance to the museum. It's always a good place to start at the beginning. Some of you, if you've been with me before on a tour, will recognize this is the front entrance. Can I pan out here? Yes, you can actually go on the museum website and you can actually look in different rooms. And this is what I'm showing you now. This is the front entrance. It's quite quiet, as you can see. They filmed this when there was no one around. And we can go inside over here now. And normally when I take people, I have these special earpieces so you can all hear and you can all walk around and look at the objects while listening to me. This is the main foyer, and you can always, it's free entry, but it's always nice to put money in over here. So next time you're there, do that. And then we go into the main great court, which is over here, this beautiful building that was done up. I'll show you the roof now. In 2000, it was originally a open air, actually. There was a central rotunda, which was the British Library. That's moved now. And around the side, as you can see over here, in a square with the museum rooms, they put this glass roof on, which enabled people to kind of use the space for special exhibitions and food and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we're going to, because we're jumping around the museum and I can't take you on all the stairs, I'm going to jump straight away to a particular room, and I'm going to take you over to here. Yes, let me show you over here. I've jumped you straight. Oh, has it gone funny already? No? Okay, that's good. Let me go over here. I want to immediately take you into this room to show you my first object, and then I'll show you the handout. So we're going to go to this room, which is 52, Iran, and I'm immediately going to show you the object at the center of this room. It's one of the wonders of the world. Anybody know what it is? It's over here. I'm going to get a bit closer. Here we go. And I'm going to scan in. Can anybody see what this object is? Write in the chat if you think you know what it is. There we go. This is the object over here that I'm looking at. Anybody want to take a guess what they think? Anybody know what that is? Oh, are we?
I'm seeing people, and they're saying the Cyrus cylinder. Richard says Cyrus cylinder. Yes, Karen says Siren cylinder. Julian says Cyrus. So a lot of people.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, but I can't unshare, which I need to do now. Sorry, I think it's crashed. But annoyed about that. I'm not sure why. Yeah, I might have to come out and come in again, as I said. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be back. I'll be back in 1 second. I apologize. I can't move out of the way though. Okay, let's just let that person in.
So don't worry. Rabbi Zarum told me he's done this lecture recently, and they've changed some technology on the site, so sometimes it boots him out. So I will find him back and we'll get him back in real quick. Although I see him there and he's kind of frozen, so I don't know what that means.
Hello again. Have you found me, Ari?
I found you, but we also have your old image up there frozen for some reason.
Yes. I don't know. I'm sorry about this. I don't know. The museum's reset the way it works, and it doesn't always work as well. So we're going to have to occasionally crash about that. I really apologize, everybody. Let's see if we can work things out. You can enable screen sharing, Ari, and then we'll carry on.
I will. Hold on for 1 moment. Let me do this.
So you're absolutely right. People that said it is the Cyrus cylinder. And what is the Cyrus cylinder and why is it important? Some people have actually argued that it's the one of the most important modern objects in terms of a modern charter of human rights. And I'll explain that to you now. Let me show you my handout and we can start going into it. Here we go. So welcome to our Purim tour. We had the first object over here. but I wanted to show you, we're going to do some highlights in the British Museum. And most of us often think of Purim as a kind of a childlike fairy story, but indeed it's a very historically grounded political text, which has lots of relevance to today, as I will explain. You all know the famous bit we have in our prayers, Ala Nissim, that we do in the Amida and the benching over Purim. We talk about Mordechai and Esther and this place Shushan. Are these real things? Are these real people? Are these real places? Can we place it in history? You know, normally we call Achashverosh in English Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus. Who's he? He's not mentioned in any archaeological data. So how do we work that out? So my tour, I'm going to talk about 3 different things: the setting of the empire, the power structures, and the palace. And we're just looking now at the Cyrus cylinder, and that's the object that I just showed you now over here. And yes, Beth is absolutely right. Very good, Beth. Beth is telling us the story of what the Cyrus cylinder is about. What language is it in? So it's written in cuneiform. You know that the ancient Egyptians wrote in hieroglyphics, and in Mesopotamia and Babylon, they wrote in cuneiform, multiple languages. So this is actually an Akkadian in Babylon, and we can date it. We can date the cylinder because King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon in 539. And he frees the place and then produces this cylinder, which was buried and discovered in Babylon in 1879. And this is the text that it says: "I am Cyrus, king of the world." This is a translation of just a few lines. "The great king, king of Babylon, king of the 4 quarters of the world. I sought the safety of the city of Babylon and all its sanctuaries. And as the population of Babylon, I freed them from their servitude." Now, what does he mean? Well, as you know, the Babylonians and the Assyrians before them, their approach was to deport people from country to country to ensure, to stop the possibility of rebellion. And by disconnecting people from their origins, they're less likely to rebel. So Babylon was full of people from all different countries and often enslaved under Babylonians. So Cyrus, as a so-called enlightened Persian king, frees them from their servitude. And he says, all the kings who sit upon thrones from every quarter, from the Tigris to the Euphrates, those who inhabit remote districts and the kings who live in tents, all of them brought their weighty tribute to me in Babylon and kissed my feet to thank me. And then, and this is the key, I sent them back to their places. Shrines that were dilapidated, I made permanent sanctuaries for them. I collected together all of their people and returned them to their settlements. So he actually says, I let people go home to their countries and rebuild their temples. This was seen as a very enlightened, multicultural, multi-ethnic leader. Instead of being like the Babylonians and the Assyrians, demanding that everybody follow their culture and follow their gods and destroy everything else, he's much more empowering. And this is going to be a theme for the Megillah and Purim, as we see. And that's why in 1971, you can see over here, it was described as the world's first Charter of Human Rights and was translated to 6 languages. And a copy of the Cyrus cylinder is in the UN headquarters in New York City. So anyone in New York, once you're able to go, you can go and see it. Now, there's different translations. You can actually look online and see the UN translation of this. I've got the original one from the museum. It's not as progressive as some people like to say, but the Iranians were very proud of the Cyrus cylinder. And that's the object I was showing you to begin with in the museum. And Tracy says it's a copy at Yale as well. Yes. Now, why is that interesting for us? Well, it's going to be the context of the Megillah, as you'll see. But actually, this Cyrus cylinder, this object, which is in the British Museum, the original, is actually described in a book of Tanakh, in the book of Ezra. The book of Ezra. Now, Ezra comes much later. Ezra comes to rebuild much later on, but Ezra only appears in chapter 7 of Ezra. The first chapter of Ezra tells the story of Cyrus, king of Persia. Look at this. It was in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. That's the first year when he's conquering. This is 540 BCE. The word of God by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. God stirred up Cyrus. So he issued a proclamation, and this is what Cyrus said. This is what Cyrus says. The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kings of the earth. For who pakadalai, and he's charged me, live not lo bait b'Yerushalayim. He's asked me to arrange that a house is built in Jerusalem, a temple in Judah. And then he says in verse 3, Mi bachem mikol amo, who amongst you of all his people? Yehi Elohav imo, let his God be with him. It's unusual. The Tanakh is talking about God indirectly, right? Saying, let his God be with him and go and build. Now, did Cyrus really say that? Did Cyrus recognize the one true God? Well, not exactly, but this is the Jewish point of view. I'll tell you what it's like. In England, about 10 years ago, when the government allowed faith schools to be funded by the government, they announced that faith schools could be built. And the Jewish community were like, great, we're going to build more Jewish schools. So the front page of all the Jewish newspapers was, government says we can build Jewish schools. Now, the government didn't say we can build Jewish schools. The government says we can build faith schools. Okay? But we interpreted it from our point of view, and that's what Ezra does. By the way, the reason we call it the room Iran, not Persia, is because Persia doesn't exist anymore. So we named it by the country that it is now. That's why room 52 that we're in is called Iran, for that person that was asking. So we have Cyrus here, and this is the beginning of the Persian Empire. Now, how many of you know about the Persian Empire? You know about the Babylonians, because they're famous, destroyed our temple in 586 BCE, conquered the whole region, conquered all of Israel. And we know about Alexander the Great a bit later on, right? Who conquers most of the known world, goes all the way, becomes Pharaoh in Egypt. But people often don't know about the Persians. And you can see over here, let's get this right, a table. Oh, sorry, just laying this up nice and neatly for you here. This table shows you the Persian period. You can see, you've got 586 BC, destroying of the temple, Babylonians up here, as I mentioned, and you've got Alexander the Great at the bottom. And in between is the Persian Empire, the Achaemenids, they're called. And when the British Museum did a special exhibition about them in 2010, the exhibition was called The Forgotten Empire, because people didn't study and didn't know about it. But it's in between. After the Babylonian, before the Greek, we have the Persian Empire, which lasts about 200 years. And there's a big debate amongst the rabbis, when does the Purim story take place? A simple reading of the Talmud makes people think it happened during the exile between 586 and 516 BCE, around here. But it doesn't work. A much better reading of the Talmud, as I'll show you, is that the Purim story takes place here between 485 and 465 BC, and I'll prove it to you. Now, the Talmud only recognizes, because of the Tanakh does it, 4 names of 4 of the kings: Cyrus, Darius, Achashverosh, and Artaxerxes. And I'm going to argue who these people are in translation. But hold on, I'll do that in a minute. But let me just explain to you what happens. Cyrus conquers Babylon. He conquers Media as well. Then he conquers, his son Cambyses conquers Egypt. And then a general after him, Darius, allows the Jews to go and start rebuilding the temple. And then the Purim story takes place. And we're going to see that in a minute. But I want to take you back into the museum. Maybe this is a mistake. Let's hope it works. If it doesn't, we'll have to stop doing that. But let's try. And I'll try now take you back into the museum. Yes, let's try this. Hopefully this will work. New share. That's right. And I will take you to the front entrance over here. Now, most of the rooms in the museum are done by thematically. So you can go to the Egyptian rooms or the Syrian rooms. But there's one room over here called the Enlightenment Room. By the way, the toilets are just over here. Anybody wants to go, just over there. And the shop's over here. But over here, this is the Enlightenment Room. And this is the room that every British person sees as their ideal. I think I showed you here last time for those who are with me. It's called, let's just get into it. There we go. This was donated by George III. Beautiful room. Look at this. Every Englishman has this ideal for their living room. Wooden floors, objects brought back from around the world, stolen, let's say, and beautiful high ceilings and bookcases and objects and all that kind of stuff. And if we go over here to this case, look what I can show you over here. This is Art and Civilization. Look what's underneath. Actually, you know what? I need to stand back a bit. Let me go over here a bit to stand back. Let's go and stand on the X marks the spot. Let's rotate around. And again, I promise you, when you come to London, I can show you all this in person. And if you have my handout with you, you can find the rooms because it's written each one. Look what's down here. Let me scan in a bit. Scroll in, look here. This is the typical Persian look. This is a picture of Darius, right? Which I'm going to argue is Achashverosh's father. And he's got Median soldiers next to him. They've got different views, right? In New York City, there's people who are trying to sport the Persian beard. It's quite a difficult thing to pull off, this look. But this hat was very Persian. And above over here is another example of Darius in here. So why are these people important? Well, let me go back to my handout and I'll show you how we fit this in and why I began with Cyrus to set the scene. So if we go, let's go to the first line of the Megillah. It's on the next sheet over here. Okay, who was Achashverosh? It was in the days of Achashverosh. Who Achashverosh? He was the king Achashverosh. Hamolech, who reigned Mehoduvad Kush, from India to Ethiopia. Sheva ve'esuma mea medina, 127 provinces. Is that a real person? Did he really reign that much on all these places? And who was he? Well, we can work it out, because in the book of Ezra, I mentioned to you earlier, in chapter 4, it mentions the kings in order. It mentions Koresh, who's Cyrus, and then Daryavesh, which we translate as Darius, and the next two are Achashverosh and Natashachta. And I'm going to argue that Achashverosh is Xerxes. Well, you'll say, but Rabbi Zarum, Xerxes doesn't sound anything like Achashverosh. But let me ask you, my friends, what language did Achashverosh speak? They spoke in Persian. Xerxes is Greek. Xerxes is a Greek translation. Achashverosh is the Hebrew translation. How did you pronounce it in Persian? What was his name in Persian? So for that, we have to understand Persian. Now, you all know that we can understand ancient hieroglyphics because of the Rosetta Stone, right? The Rosetta Stone had Greek on it and hieroglyphics, and that allowed Champollion in the 1820s to translate it. A similar thing happened with ancient cuneiform. Look at this. In North Iran, there's a on the side of a huge mountain is something called the Behustan stone, which has cuneiform writing, and then Old Persian, which is very similar to modern Persian. And in the 1800s, Sir Henry Rawlinson, he's mentioned underneath here, Sir Henry Rawlinson, who was a retired Major General from the British Army, was now an explorer, and he wrote down, this is his whole handwritten symbols over here, cuneiform, and cracked the code of how to do it. Well, he went back a number of times. He had to be let down on a pulley because it was the side of a 300-foot steep mountain. He's let down on a pulley by some people helping him, and he wrote down this, and he cracked the language. And you can see over here, can you see it says he's written in his hand, Daryavush. When he could read the cuneiform, that says Daryavush, and that's the Persian translating. Daryavush is what the Greeks translated as Darius, and what the Hebrew says is Daryavesh. So the Hebrew is remarkably similar to the Persian. Daryavush, that's him over here. And his father was, you see over here, Chashayasha. Chashayasha. And Chashayasha, I'm going to argue, is Achashverosh. Now you'll say, but it's not exactly the same. There's an A at the front. You know, why is it A? Why is it not Achashverosh? Why do you have the A? Well, when you translate Hebrew, so when you translate another language into Hebrew, if it begins with two consonants, you always add an aleph. For instance, Plato. How do you say Plato in Hebrew? Because it's a PL, two consonants, you say Aplaton. That's just a grammatical issue of the way the language is structured. So that's why we put an A in front. And therefore, you now have Achashverosh is Achashverosh, and then you've got the Vuz, the Achashverosh. Why do you have the Vuz? Well, the Vavs are often there to help read it in the Hebrew. And if you look at the Megillah this Thursday night, notice, Achashverosh is spelt in three ways. He's spelt with two Vavs, Achashverosh. He's spelt with one Vav, and in the last chapter with no Vavs. So you go to the last chapter, no Vavs, and take out the Aleph for Aplaton, and you end up with Chashayash. It's pretty much the same name. And therefore, grammatically, it's a very good argument to say that Achashverosh is Xerxes. The Greeks couldn't do the chaz and the shiz, so they just did ksah. That's why they do it. By the way, you all have heard of Major General Henry Rawlinson. I might have mentioned this before when he translated why. Any of you fans of, I think I might have mentioned this in the other tour that I did with you. Anybody fans of Gilbert and Sullivan, Pirates of Penzance? Remember that song? He's a model of a modern major general, and one verse says he can translate a Babylonian washing form in perfect cuneiform. That is a reference to Major General Henry Rawlinson, who 20 years before the musical was put out, had cracked the code of cuneiform, and Gilbert and Sullivan were putting it into their musical as a historical memory. So that's what allows us to understand that Achashverosh is, in fact, Xerxes. And once we know that, we're really on a roll. You know why? Because of this. And I'll unshare to show you. Look at this. Am I speaking of you? Okay, you got to do me here. Yes, that's right. This is Herodotus. Herodotus, early historian, 5th century BCE, not more than a century after the Purim story is set. And he writes the histories of the battles between the ancient Persians and the Greeks, from the Greek point of view. And book 7 is all about Xerxes living in his major palace in Susa. And Susa, you've worked out, is Shushan. Does it exist? You bet. And in 1973, they went and dug it up. And I got hold of this very big, thick book, which is called The Palace of Darius. Darius was Xerxes' father, Achashverosh's father, at Susa. Right now it's been flattened. All you'll see there now is basic foundations, but they go 10 foot deep. And you can actually work out the water systems and the plumbing because it was such an advanced palace. And this book has page by page and pictures of what it must have looked like and the excavations that were all done in that time. It's an amazing book, and it reveals so much about the Megillah once you understand who we're talking about. So let me take you now. Let me show you briefly in the museum. Look at this interesting thing. Let's go back to that object we were looking at. Remember over here? Let's pan out. Look what's on each side. Isn't it interesting? What objects does he have? On the left-hand side, they have objects from India. And on the right-hand side, they have objects. This is a Sphinx type picture from Egypt. Isn't that interesting? So you have Persia in the middle, India on one side, and Egypt on the other. And that theme is repeated over here in the museum. Look at this. Over here again, we have picture stones from Susa Palace. Here's a picture of Darius, and above it, and other ones over here, Darius again. And above it, we have objects. We have Osiris, which is from Egypt, and then objects from India. Why do we do that? Well, you know, from the Megillah, because the Megillah said that he reigned mehodu va'ad Kush. He reigned from, here's the map, from India, the Indus River, all the way to Kush, beyond Egypt. So in the British Museum, when it shows you Persian objects, it has Egyptian ones on one side and Indian ones on the other, because that was the size of his empire. You can see it over here. Let me just answer your questions in the chat. Let me see. Palace of Darius, that's what you're showing that stuff. Excellent, thank you. Now, this is really wild, okay? Because I'm going to show you now that the way the Persians described their empire is exactly the way we did as well. Right now, we won't have time to do everything tonight, but this I want to show you because it's really fun. Look at this. So now, what was his palace? You can see Shushan over here. It's actually called Susa, but this is a Purim map, so I'm using Shushan. He actually had a number of capitals that he went, that Xerxes and his father Darius settled in. Because they'd unified all these peoples. By the way, do you know how large this is? This is 10 million square miles, the Persian Empire. 2 million people he has to look after. How do you run a civilization like that 2,500 years ago? That's going to be an important thing to understand. One part of it is he didn't just have one palace. He had a palace in Shushan. He had one in Persepolis over here. He had another one in Ecbatana, which used to be in the Median capital, and also in Babylon. And he would travel between them. Why? Well, first of all, it gets very hot in the summer, so he traveled north in the summer to Ecbatana, where it was cooler. He spent a lot of time in Shushan, the one that he built with his father, Darius. And the reason he would travel was to bind the empire together. Just like our queen. When I say our queen, I'm talking about the British Empire. Every summer, our queen goes to Scotland, to Balmoral Castle. And there's loyal Scottish citizens waving flags as she goes in. And our Duke, her husband, who's not well, before Shalema, he's got an infection. He should be well. He's 100 years old, our Duke. He's called Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. And Charles is Prince of Wales. Why? By mentioning these different parts of our country, it unifies it together. So Xerxes would travel around. I actually have a book all about the life of Xerxes. I hold up on my picture over here. Xerxes, a life, a modern version of the life of Xerxes. We know so much about him. He would travel around in order to keep the empire together. Now, when they dug up Persepolis, they found in the base of Persepolis, there's not the British Museum, it's another object, which is in another museum, is over here. Can you see this? Often at the center of a new construction, they'll place deep in the ground some information about its origins and its birth. If it's ever destroyed, it can be dug up. And inside, they found these gold plates. In 1938, a stone box, the Palace of Persepolis contained 2 gold plates, and this is what it says. Darius the Great King, King of Kings. It says, King of Countries and Achmenid. That was Cyrus's line. King Darius says, this is the kingdom which I hold, from Saki, which is beyond Sogdiana, from there as far as Kush, and from India as far as Sardis. Now, it mentions 4 places on the map to describe his empire. And I'm now, through the wonders of modern technology, going to draw it for you. Let's see if I can do this. I'm going to get to the art. How do I do that? More. I've forgotten how to do this now. How do I do this? Do you have that option of drawing, Ari? with the art. I'm trying to see if you got it here. More breakout rooms, pause. Do you not have drawings over here?
I don't think I can draw on your art.
Oh, you don't do drawing on your one. Okay. Well, I'll do it with my mouse. Can you see my mouse moving? Can you see that moving, Ari, the mouse? Or not?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes. Okay. So let me read you what it says. Darius says that his kingdom went from, I'm reading out what I just read to you. It went from Saki, which is on Sogdiana. That's over here. These are the Scythians, by the way. His empire went from here all the way to Kush. That's his description in the text. That means from here to here. It's a diagonal. Kush down here. That's the thing. My mouse is moving. Diagonal. That's one diagonal. And then it says, and it also went from the Indus River to Sardis. The Indus River's down here, and Sardis is the very edge of Turkey where it meets the Aegean Sea, where the Greeks are. So it's another diagonal. So when he's describing his empire, he does it in two diagonals, along here and along here. Why diagonals? It's very simple. Your television. How large is your television? 50 inches, is it? That's not the vertical or the horizontal. That's the diagonal. That determines the size of the screen. So we do two diagonals here, as described over here, to determine the size. Now, what's interesting is the bottom of the two parts of the diagonal are the Indus and Kush, right? Just to remind you again. Remember, it goes from Saki to Kush and from Indus to Sardis. So the Megillah only mentions the bottom two of the four places mentioned. Why? Because in the Bible, Saki up here is not important. The Scythians don't get that involved in the Bible, and neither do the Greeks. That happens after the Bible's finished. We're only interested in these two regions. So not only does the Bible talk about the empire being from Hodu ad Kush, just like it does here, but the same way of describing it is both in ancient Persian writings as in the Megillah as well. And you see it over here now. There's another version of the map I'm showing you with the major capitals over here. So what I'm trying to show you here is we can actually understand the life of Xerxes because it's so similar to the way they describe themselves. And as I mentioned as well, there's these books, the Herodotus, the Histories, and Aeschylus wrote a book on the Persians as well. And they both tell you about the life of Xerxes. So you know what I've done? You can take the life of Xerxes inside these books and the Megillah and put the two together and work out what was going on in his world. So let me show you another object because I always like going back to the museum to appreciate that. Let me take you now to, let's see, we go up here. We look at this object here. Now let's go upstairs again. Here we go. And hopefully this won't crash. If it does, can I move? Yes. Oh, good. I can move. Excellent. Good. Let's go. Where are we? Sorry, wrong way. Let's go out of the room into the corridor. Oh, gotta make sure it's going the right way. There we go. That's where I want to go. Into the corridor. And on the stairway, it's a very important thing. And I love showing people this because it's just on the stairs because it's convenient. Look at this. Let me hold on to this closer. This is a relief, a copy from the palace at Persepolis. And what is this? Can you see who this is? This is Xerxes. All the commentaries say this is Xerxes sitting on his throne, holding a scepter. And he's got a servant behind him, waving a fan, keeping him cool in the hot summer months. And look what's underneath him. And if you've seen the movie 300, which Xerxes is in it, which is Achashverosh, you see this similar. Can you see? There's people literally holding him up. This is a metaphor for his power. That all these different nations hold up the king. And what you notice when you look carefully is they're all slightly different. Look at their trousers. That's got culottes. That's got a kind of a shorter skirt. That's got a wrap. That's got a longer wrap. And also their faces are slightly different. Can you see? Implying that each one is from a different nation. These are all the nations on which Xerxes was built. Can you see? If I pan out, you can now see them all. And you can actually work it out from their outfits, what they were. This is an image of Xerxes. When I take people here, there's always all different. Every time I do a tour in the British Museum, there's always Jews walking around it, and quite often Israelis. And a whole bunch of Haredim were there once, and they didn't know what they're looking at. And I said, Slicha, Tem Yodim, Zeh Achashverosh. This is, and they go, Be'emet, Zehu, is that him? I was like, Ken, Zehu. They didn't even realize what they're looking at because it says Xerxes, but they can't read the English. And even if they could, they wouldn't know that's Achashverosh. But that's who he is. That is Achashverosh. And this is from the palace in Persepolis from about 470 BCE. And you see all the nations that he's in control of on top of this. And as I pointed out to you, he's got his scepter. Now, you know why that's interesting? Because the pharaohs don't have scepters. They have something else. And Babylonians and the Assyrians don't have scepters. The only one with the scepter of that shape is the Persian Achashverosh, Xerxes. And why is that interesting? Well, I bet you've worked it out already. Because what do we learn in the Megillah? Remember when Mordechai says to Esther, go and talk to Achashverosh? Just so I'm giving you a headache, I'm just scrolling down now. And she says, I can't, here we go, here's a picture of it. I can't go and visit the king. You know why? Because unless you're called to the king, you'll die. Unless you're summoned, you'll be put to death, it says in chapter 4. The only way to get to the king is levad me'asher yoshit lo hamelech et shavit hazahav. Shavit is a Hebrew word which means scepter. Only if he puts out his golden scepter can I go and speak to him. So Mordechai says, well, go on. And so she does in chapter 5. And it was the Queen Esther was standing in the court and she found favor by Yoshet HaMelech Esther et Shavit HaZahav. And the king put out his golden scepter and she could go and speak to him. That's what's described. And by the way, no one else in Tanakh has a Shavit HaZahav, a golden scepter. It's exclusive to the Megillah and to Achashverosh, which is great because it's also exclusive to Xerxes in the British Museum. Isn't that amazing? Straight out, you can literally hold up your Megillah and see it. Let me just look at the questions in the chat over here. Extended a scepter, absolutely right. Are any of the other Persian kings depicted with this scepter or just Xerxes? No, Darius as well. The scepter was a Persian thing. I was just saying that we don't actually have that many pictures of them, but yes, but they were other ones depicted. Okay. I'm just getting something over here. Now let's keep going. And now, as I told you, here's what I can do. Look at this. What I've done over here is I've taken the life. Let me take my jump off and get quite hot. This is the life of Xerxes from Aeschylus and Herodotus and the Megillah put together. And when you put them together, you work out the most amazing things. So let me show you something which will impress your friends over Purim. I wonder if you ever noticed this. What year does the Purim story take place? Well, it tells you. It was in the Bashanat Shlosh Lamalchot. It was in the 3rd year of the reign of Xerxes. We now know it's Achashverosh, in the 3rd year of his reign. And what does he do? He does that big party, right? He invites everybody for this big party, this big banquet. And who does he invite? Chel Plasumadai. Ever noticed that before? Chel is the word chayal, soldier. The soldiers, the military power plus, which is Persia, and Media, which was the first place that Cyrus conquered years back. And it had all these nobles and princes together. So the party took place in the 3rd year of his reign. Okay, that's all fine. And what happened? You all know what happened. They get very drunk. He wants to call out Vashti. She's not happy. He ends up either killing or sending Vashti away. He has to find a new wife in chapter 2. And they do the big beauty pageant and ends up marrying Esther. So what year does he marry Esther? You'd expect it to be, well, just after, right? When kids do a little play about Purim, you have the story of the party and the next scene is finding a new wife. So maybe in the 4th year. But no, you might have noticed it, but the Megillah says what year. When Esther was taken to Achashverosh, it was B'Shanat Shevel Malcho. It was in the 7th year. She was crowned in the 7th year, which was 4 years after. Why did it take 4 years to get a new wife? What was going on in that period? Okay. Yes, she bathed in oils for a year, Sarah, but not 4 years. So what's the gap? Why is there a gap? Doesn't make any sense when you read the Megillah. But if you look at the life of Xerxes, it all fits into place. Look at this. His father, Darius, was always fighting the Greeks. The famous Battle of Marathon. That's why a marathon is 25 miles, because that's how far he had to run when they were defending it. Okay, so originally his father, Xerxes' father, Darius, was fighting the Greeks in 490. And then he lost. So what he does, Darius, his father, in 486, he spends 3 years building an army so he could return and conquer the Greeks. Because the Greeks, even though the Persians had a bigger army, the Greeks were better fighters. They hadn't unified yet with Alexander. That's why they hadn't taken over the world. They were little city-states, Sparta and Athens and so on, Macedonia. But they were great fighters. They'd be fighting each other for years in the Peloponnesian Wars and so on. That's later on. So they were great fighters. And Darius lost. So he gets an army together to fight them. But what happened? In Darius in 486, the Egyptians, who he'd already conquered, were part of his empire. Darius was the pharaoh. Right? There's actually pictures in the British Museum of Darius looking like a pharaoh in Egypt. I know it's hard enough to learn one country, others, but they had Persian kings dressed like pharaohs. Maybe I'll show you later if we get a chance. So what happened is that Egypt rebelled. So Darius had to put down the Egyptian rebellion before he could go and conquer the Greeks again. But what happened? He died. He got ill and died. And his father Xerxes, as a young man in his 20s, comes to the throne in 485 BCE. Xerxes becomes king. So what does he do? First thing he does, put down the Egyptian revolt. That's what you've got to do to strengthen the empire. And then he wants to do what his father never managed to do, which is conquer the Greeks. So Xerxes, in 484, spends 4 years mustering and preparing the largest army the world has ever seen. 1,700,000 soldiers, according to Herodotus. Persians, Medes, Scythians, Hyrcaeans, Assyrians, Bactrians, Scythians, 30 nations in all. And he does a huge party for them. And it's a mustering party by bringing the noble military leaders from all the major countries together and getting them drunk and inspiring them. He's unifying them under the flag of Persia to beat the Greeks and expand their territory. That's why the Megillah says that it was Chel Prasu Madai. It was a mustering party. And that's what he did in that third year. And then what did he do for the next 3 years? He went to fight. He left. The fight then took place, and he only returned Xerxes, according to Herodotus, in the 7th year. And he lost. Xerxes lost. He was not successful. He comes back despondent, and according to Herodotus, takes up with many women. And in the Megillah, the 7th year is the year of the pageant, and he marries Esther. So can you see the life of Xerxes and the life of Achashverosh in the Megillah exactly parallel? It all fits together really, really well. Yes. Don't get me started on Prince Caspian and the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's a whole other story. That's to do with C.S. Lewis, but also his mate, who was Tolkien. Tolkien and Lewis were great friends in Cambridge. We can do that another time if you're interested about the differences between Lord of the Rings and Narnia, but that's for another time. But anyway, right. So can you see it works beautifully? And interestingly, for the rest of his life, again, you'll get this handout, but the Megillah takes 12 years, by the way. All the story with Haman and all that kind of stuff with Mordechai takes place during 12 years. And as Xerxes has a number of different battles, and Xerxes actually lived much longer than that. He lived till 20 years of his reign, 465. And in fact, Xerxes, in the end, really was assassinated. Do you know who by? 2 insiders, one a palace guard and one a general. That's what it says in Aeschylus. He was assassinated by a palace guard and a general working on the inside to kill him, which is amazing. Why? Because in the Megillah, in chapter 2, you have Bigtan and Teresh. Remember, Mordechai overhears 2 soldiers in palace guards plotting to kill Xerxes. So the writer of the Megillah definitely knew about the life of Xerxes and Achashverosh, and he weaves it into the story. Again, this doesn't prove that the Megillah is true. It proves that the writer of it knew the life of Xerxes, as I'll show you in a minute, knew the palace and knew the culture, and that's why the two piece together so well. Okay, yes, I know you didn't know this in Yeshiva, for those that are saying in the chat. Okay, now just a few more things. We're very short on time, so I'm going to show you all the objects in the room, and then I'll show you my handout. That's the easiest way of doing it, I think, because that way we're at least likely to crash. Or if we crash, we'll only crash once. So let's go back now. Let's pan out, and let's go back into room 52, upstairs in the British Museum. If I can rotate, here we go. That room over there is the Egyptians. Pharaoh's in there, Ramses II, but we'll do that another time. I think I might have shown you him. This time we're going over here. Let's go back into the room. There was a Cyrus cylinder. And now I want to show you other objects. So let me show you around the room. So let me show you, for instance, over here. And these are objects over here. Let's just stand over here. Now, in this room, and you have to trust me a bit, when you see them up close, you'll see, but there's a lot of drinking vessels. And it talks in the notes about the different cups that were used by the Persians for drinking. They would make wine, grape wine, and heavy wine and fig wine, and they had all these different kind of cups and bowls because they did a lot of drinking. There's a major one over here. We'll come to the drinking in a minute. So that's one thing that was very important to them, the drinking. Again, I would flick backwards and forwards to my handout, but because I'm worried about it crashing, I'm not going to do that. Let me move over here and let me show you something I mentioned earlier. This over here. Let me scan on it. Can you see what it is? Let me do it over here. It's a wooden block and printed on it. See if anybody remembers what I said earlier. Do you know what that is? What's that over here? That's a pharaoh. And the hieroglyphic says, you know who that pharaoh is? Want to write in the chat that I mentioned earlier? Anybody remember what I was telling you about the pharaohs? That is Darius. Kings became actually the pharaohs because they conquered that country. So that's over here. It's described over here. Yes, he's Darius dressed as, just read it, Darius dressed as Pharaoh of Egypt. That's what it is over here. Okay, let's pan out again. And I want to show you other objects that are important. So you know why drinking is important. I showed you the cups because that was important in the Megillah. But another thing that's interesting is Esther. Remember? Esther has to beautify herself. And as someone put in the chat, they spent a year, all these princesses, so I'm just finding the right place. These princesses spent a year beautifying themselves to look good in front of Achashverosh. Oops, sorry. Oh, sorry, it keeps jumping around. Let's do it more clearly. Where am I? Right, there we go. So it's jumping around a bit. So I want to go over to the square over here. And as I told you, yes, the women spent almost a year beautifying themselves. Are there any pictures of women in this room? So I looked around, and they don't often have pictures of women. It's mainly men, but there's an exception. I'm trying to get find the little X marks a spot over here to stand in. Okay, we'll have to do it from over here. Oh, there it is. Sorry, it's a bit temperamental. There we go. Now look over here. I'll see if I can show it in. They're over here. Look at these bottles over here. Can you see them? Can I get in closer? Yeah, that's my maxim. These are perfume bottles. That's what it describes over here. These are perfume bottles, and they would carve the shape of a woman on the actual bottle. That's how we know what they were, and they were for perfumes. And it's interesting, and there's a whole little paragraph written about how the Persians used to love making these beautiful cosmetic bottles for the women. And that relates very similar to chapter 2 in our Megillah, which talks about the women and the cosmetics. One final thing I want to show you on this is over here as well. Yes, this object over here. Let's see if I can pan in. Here we go. Can you see over? It's very difficult to see. It's over here. It's a very little gold. This is the Oxus treasure. Lots of pictures of horses and a horse and a chariot, which are very important. You see over here? Very important to the Persians. You know what? On my handout, they're much clearer. Let's see if I can stop share. It's going to let me do it. So it's going to crash again. Okay, Ari, I need to help you because I won't do it again. We're going to go in and go out again for this. Is that okay?
Okay. Yep.
Actually, you know what? Let me stay here one more time, because if I'm going to have to go out again, let me just show you one more object here, because I'm worried it'll crash. So let's just do one more thing before we go. They actually have things from the palace of Susa here. So I have to show them to you, right?
Okay, stay tuned. I will find him. We'll let him back in. Hopefully you're enjoying this tour. You're welcome to tip CSP at the end. Don't worry, you can go online. You can go to the shop. It's fine. I'm sure there's a shop online. Let's see if we can find our guy here. I'm sure he's trying to get back in. It's pretty impressive. We're doing all this. He's in the UK. And we're all around the world, so we're getting there. I'll take this opportunity to say that Rafi will be back March 16th. He will not be taking us on a tour that will crash. It's a discussion about the life and thought of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. So March 16th at 12:30 p.m. Put that in your calendar. He also has a program that I've been working on with him about the Sistine Chapel. So we'll go on a tour of the Sistine Chapel and we'll look at it compared to our biblical text. In the meantime, we're just trying to make sure he gets back in the room so he can finish this teaching, or else I'm going to have to call on one of you to start teaching for us. Oh, I think I'm
back. Here we go. Sorry about that.
There you are.
The British Museum reconfigured the way it does its website, and the result is that it keeps crashing when I show the thing too much. That's why I wanted to show you all the objects at the same time. So if you enable me to share, then I'll show you the handout, and all the objects are in big pictures on the handout as well. And if you're smart, everybody, you can then use the handout to go into the British Museum yourself and find these objects again. But if I can share, does that work? Can I share now, Ari? Oh, no. Can you allow me to share? Cool. Great. There we go. Right, apologies for that, everybody. Really sorry about that. Yeah, really sorry about that. But I can see all the objects over here. And now we get to understand them much more. So remember I showed you those cups. That wonderful cup. Oh, yeah, I'm going to make you read something in a minute, by the way, because I know you're going to enjoy this. See these cups? Look what the Megillah said. The Megillah says, "V'hashkot b'chlei zahav v'kelim mikelim shonim v'yayin malchut rav kadat hamelach." And they gave them to drink in vessels of gold, vessels of all different designs. Kelim shonim. We saw those kelim shonim. It's because to make them feel comfortable, Achashverosh, Xerxes, had cups that were made from all different regions in his empire. Also, what was the rule of drinking at the party that he had? Vashtiyah kadat. What was the rule for drinking? Ein ones. No restrictions. Kiken yisod hamelach halav beitar. This is what the king gave orders, right? La'asot kitson ish ve'ish. Anybody could drink whatever they liked. Now, this is going to be important in the last few minutes of our tour to understand the Egyptian culture. So not Egyptian, the Persian culture, because they allowed them to do what they liked. This was Xerxes' approach. Just like Cyrus had let them go back and build their own temples, Achashverosh, Xerxes lets them drink what they like in the palace. Now, Ari, do you want to just read this text from Herodotus about the way the Persians used to drink? They are very fond of wine. Do you want to read this for me?
Sure. They are very fond of wine, and no one is allowed to vomit or urinate in the presence of another person.
I thought you'd like that.
Yeah, that
I appreciate that. Right.
That's also a requirement of a CSP weekend retreat.
Absolutely. Now read this.
If an important decision is to be made, they discuss the question when they are drunk, which is, I think, how some of our past administrations made decisions here in the United States and probably in Europe as well. The following day, the master of the house, where the discussion was held, submits their decision for reconsideration when they are sober. Interesting. If they still approve it, it is adopted. If not, it is abandoned. Conversely, any decision that they make when they are sober is reconsidered afterwards when they are drunk.
Well, that's just crazy. Now, Herodotus is obviously exaggerating about this, but isn't it fascinating? He's talking about the Persians make decisions when they're drunk, which is what the Megillah says about Achashverosh. And then he wakes up the next morning when Vashti's dead and regrets it when he's sober. It also talks about if they do it when they're sober, they do it when they're drunk, and drunk when they're sober. It's all about flicking, which is what the Megillah is about, for Na'afochu, turning things on its head. The horse that Haman thought was for him was for Mordechai, and the gallows he made for Mordechai, he ended up being hanged upon. So we see this reversal going on similarly in Herodotus. In fact, when you read Herodotus, knowing the Megillah, you notice so many different things. I'll give you another example. Remember the perfume bottles I told you about? Look, Esther found favor in the eyes of all those who saw her. She didn't use these perfume bottles that I showed you earlier. She just came as she was. And this is very important to understand the story. This is very important to understand the story. Why? Let me show you about Vashti. This is a very horrible text. There's a lot of text about Vashti. I'm only going to do one with you. The way he paraded her about. What does the Talmud say? Achashverosh says to his guests, half drunk, he says, Kali sha'ani mishtamesh bo, the vessel that I use, right? Or that I use inside. It's horrible language. You know what he means. The vessel that I used, bo, inside, ein olam madai. It's not Persian. So it's not Median, Velo Parsi, it's not Persian, Elakasti, it's Chaldean, which means Babylonian. Right? He says, my vessel that I get to fill, he said, it's not a Median one, it's not a Persian vessel. He's comparing Vashti to a cup, right? It's not Babylonian, Ella Kasti, it's Babylonian. Do you want to see her? She's literally a trophy wife, like a trophy, a big cup that he wants to show off. Now, why this is interesting, because it reveals that it matters where Vashti is from. Vashti was a Babylonian princess, and when Babylon was conquered, she was married off to Xerxes, to Achashverosh. Now, why is this important? Because that was a way of unifying the kingdom. That's what English kings, British kings used to do. They'd get their sons to marry French princesses in order to unify the connection between different countries. So that's what Vashti's role was. She was there to keep the Babylonians happy. The problem is Achashverosh got her killed, and they needed to replace her. And the person they wanted to replace her with had to be a princess that would work for the whole country. Imagine if she turned up and she was too Median. The Medians would be happy, but everybody else wouldn't be. If she looked like a Scythian with her makeup, the Scythians would be happy, but nobody else would. So the problem in this beauty pageant is that all, just like those horrible Miss Worlds that used to happen, they all dressed in their uniform of the outfit of their country, and it was all nice for the people from that country, but the other ones didn't like it. So Esther didn't put on much makeup. She was bland. She was just her pure beauty. And the fact that she hid, Esther is to hide, her own origins was perfect, because they were looking for a princess who could symbolize Persia, Mother Persia, without a particular background. That's what they wanted. Just think of the princesses we have in our country. We've got Kate, and now we just got Meghan, and we don't like Meghan, as you can see. She had too much of a background. Her dad was a bit complicated. She had a bit of a film background, and eventually now she's gone off with Harry. We don't like them so much because she was too particular. Whereas Kate Middleton, who married our eldest, William, we love him. You know why? Because she decided to become a princess. She didn't try and do her background. She adopted the style of being a British princess. I watched on the day she got married, when they went from Westminster Abbey back to the palace in their beautiful carriage chariot, her and William in their wedding outfits. As they passed every statue, William saluted them. These statues are all to different war memorials that the British had fought over hundreds of years. Each one they went past, William saluted, and she demurely put her head down. She'd been trained how to act like a princess. And what she did was important because people whose families had fought in all those battles noticed when she did that. Kate has become the symbol of Britain. She's one of the most photographed women in the world. What outfits she wears, everybody wants to wear. And she now symbolizes Britain. That's just a metaphor, lahavdil, of what was going on with Esther in Persia. How do you unify 10 million square miles, 2 million people? By having symbols that unify everybody together. And Esther was a perfect symbol because she didn't look too much like any particular country. They could put on her what they wanted to do. Esther became the image of Persia. That's a key idea. The next idea that fits in with this is the edicts, which I want to show you. Now, you know, everyone thinks, and I'm going to, sorry for ruining your yeshiva or cheder background again, but everybody thinks the end of chapter 1 has got this crazy bit where Achashverosh says every man can be a authority in his own home. That's the result of him being upset by Vashti. That's not what the pasuk says. If you look at the last verse of chapter 1, this is what it says. He sent out letters to every province, according to the writings, that every people, and it was in each language, kilshono, so he's writing in multiple languages, liyot kol ish, that every man, this means every leader in the local province, could be a sorer, a local authority, beveito, in his local area. Bayit doesn't mean house, bayit means region or palace. Umudaber kol shalomah, can speak in the language of his people. What Achashverosh was saying is, the reward after Vashti is killed, he is really nervous. There's going to be rebellion, that all the different 127 provinces are going to rebel against each other. So he sends a message out. And by the way, he doesn't do it in one language. He does it in whatever language you want, right? Multiple languages. I live in Barnet in London. And when the Barnet website, when they want to say something, it's translated into 30 languages because it's a multicultural society. So everybody can understand what is being said. So Xerxes, Achashverosh, has it translated into all different languages and says, you know what? You can be a local leader in your area. Don't rebel against me. I'm giving you local authority. That's what sorer means. If you think I'm making this stuff up, this is what Rav Eliezer Ashkenazi in the 16th century said. Look what he says. Od rotzel hodia. Achashverosh wanted this new law to be known by all the leaders of the provinces, to show them respect, so that each of them would have authority, sorer, in his own region. They were not forced to learn and adopt the official script and language of Achashverosh, as was the norm of all those who'd been subjugated by other conquerors. Xerxes, Achashverosh, was doing a new kind of leadership. Multi-languages, you would send out messages in all different languages that each one can understand it and can feel local authority. Local power. So effectively, the chapter 1 goes from the king, the autocratic king, which was the style of Babylon and Assyria and Egypt and Akkad before, and now became the sorer, which is going from central imperial domination to local authority. So how did Achashverosh rule? By something that I call, well, Joseph Nye called soft power. Soft power is when you control not through invading and conquering, but by influencing through cultural norms. America does it with Hollywood, and British do it through the BBC World Service. You encourage culture around a wider region. That's what Achashverosh was doing. That's how he managed to hold his country together. Now, a key way of to make that work, you have to be able to get your message out. Just like nowadays, we have mobile phones to get our messages out, and Ari can send a message on a WhatsApp or email, and you all immediately know what's going on. So how did Xerxes do it? Because it's a huge landmass that he's got to cover. So he sent letters, as I showed you. And the letters is a big theme in the Megillah. Look at this. In chapter 1 and 3 and 8, first there's the letters Achashverosh sends. Then there's the letters that Haman sends to kill the Jews. Then the letters that Mordechai that says. There's loads of letters, the whole thing of the Megillah. And it says each time, Midina, Kitzavah, Va'am, Kilshonah, each one in its own language. And how did they send them? They send them on horseback. Look at this. Couriers. But then in chapter 8 is the most wild text. Look at this. It's unique in the whole Tanakh. It tells you about the style of horses that they had. Vaishlach Safarim, and they sent letters, Biyadavatzim, on couriers, Basusim, on horseback, Rochvei HaVechesh, Ha'achshtaranim, on swift horses, B'nei HaRamachim, of royal mares. Why do I care about the breed of horse that's being used? This is unique in Tanakh. This obsession with telling us exactly what kind of horse was used. You know why? Remember that object that I showed you in the British Museum? That's up close, by the way. Horseback riding in Persian. It was a big thing. You know why? To cross the country. Look at this map. There was something called the Persian Royal Road. It was 1,700 miles long. It had tributaries all over Persia, and it went from Susa, Shushan capital, all the way to the front, to Sardis, the very edge of the empire. 1,700 miles. Do you know how long it took them to cross it? 7 days. 7 days only to cross that 1,500 miles. 2,500 years ago, how did they do it? Because they dug what's called the Royal Road. They flattened and had a wide path for horses to ride upon, and they put a horse every day. Separate horse. Look at this. I'm going to quote you Herodotus, and this is Herodotus praising the Persians, so we know that it's true. He says, nothing travels as fast as the Persian messengers. The entire plan is a Persian invention, says Herodotus. And this is how it works. Along the line of the road, there are riders stationed with horses in number equal to the number of days which the journey takes, allowing a man and a horse each day. Nothing stops these couriers from accomplishing their best speeds, the distance that they have to go. Neither snow, rain, heat, or darkness of night. Sounds like your famous postal service in America, right? The post has to get out there. There's that new movie, The World News, with Tom Hanks, that's on Netflix about that issue as well, spreading news. The first rider delivers his dispatch to the second to the third, and is borne hand to hand along the whole line. Herodotus says it's a Persian invention. Why? Because Xerxes wants the lead by soft power. To do that, you need to get your message out as fast as possible to the whole country in its own language. Everyone feels Xerxes cares about me. What's Queen Esther wearing this summer? What are the trends? We read the letters. We know what's going on in the palaces. Can you see how modern the Megillah is? The Megillah is the first modern book of Tanakh. All the older books of Tanakh talk about kings controlling empires. We don't have that anymore. And idolatry, we don't have that anymore. There's no idolatry in the Megillah. It's a very secular book. It's all about cultural control. This is what we're living in today. And by the way, if you want to be really smart about this, do you remember how the Torah began? What was the first attempted empire to try and get everybody together? It was the Tower of Babel. Remember that? Where they all spoke Dvarim Achadim, one language, all together. And what did God do to stop empires getting big again? He changed all their languages. Chapter 11 of Genesis, the Tower of Babel story. And that's what stopped kingdoms from getting bigger over time, because of their languages. The Babylonians tried to control and there were rebellions. And even Darius, Xerxes' father, I showed you, had rebellions. So how did Xerxes solve the problem of Tanakh that God had set up in chapter 11 of Genesis? Allow them all to speak their languages. I'll do multicultural. And this is why the rabbi said that if in the future, the Tanakh might get forgotten, but the Torah and the Megillah will last forever, because Esther is the last book of the Bible, one of the last chronologically, and it's a modern book. We live in a culture like this. Assimilation has taken many more Jews away from Judaism than any attack, even during the Holocaust, in terms of course, it was worse, Jews died physically, but I'm saying in terms of commitment to our faith, acculturation, assimilation has been much more powerful than actually killing us. And that's what Xerxes did. He assimilated the Jews. That's what he was trying to do in the story. That's why it's so important that Esther stands up. So that's why the Megillah talks about letters and horses, because that was a Persian thing. You see, now it's all beginning to make sense. Now we're going to do one more thing in the last 5 minutes. I know I've gone over, and then we'll finish. I'll try and do that in 5 minutes, then I'll take your questions. But let me just look at the chat. Pony Express, you got it. That's right. Other comments here. Did you know that many of the objects that were pointed out were filials from the trappings of the horse? No, but that's connected to it as well. Absolutely. Thank you. Now, final thing, the palace itself. Here we go. Remember I told you? Can you see over here? This is what Susa looks like today. It's completely flat. But they mapped it out on that book that I showed you. And this is what they worked out, the shape of the palace over here. Okay, let me show you. And this is a three-dimensional version of it over here. Oh, can you hear me? Are you still there? Have I lost you?
We're still here.
Oh, good. Okay, good. So something changed in my sound. Okay, just 2 or 3 minutes and I'll finish. This is the palace. We worked out from the excavations. So you can see the bits of knocked over things over here. By the way, 1 year, I'd love to do a Megillah reading at night with actors and actresses in these different rooms. But basically, here's the palace. This is called the King's Gate. Actually, you know, I'll show it on the one up here. It's quite here. This is the King's Gate. You can see it in the notes as well. If I move this up here. Yes. This is the King's Gate over here, number 1. And that's where Mordechai sat and overheard Bigtan and Teresh plotting to kill the king. And if you got to go into the palace, you got into the outer court over here, and you might get to go into the gardens and walk around the Apadana over here. Or if you're very lucky, you got to the inner courtyard, and 6 and 7 is the king's own royal residence. And behind him is where the harem was. Number 8 is the harem, where all the princesses would live, and number 11 is the court of the harem. Can you see this? Number 11 is the harem's courtyard. This is all from the palace at Susa. If you want to fit three-dimensionally, they did a mock-up like this. You see, this is the King's Gate. You would enter the outer courtyard here, then you'd go and hang out in the gardens if you're wealthy over here. And this number 6 and 7, can you see it's slightly raised as the King's Palace, and behind it is the harem, and the other courtyard over here. Do you know why that's interesting? Because the Megillah mentions all the places I just showed you. It really does. I've gone through the entire Megillah and looked at the places. Look at this one over here. When Mordechai wants to check on Esther, it says, where would he go? Lifnei Chatzer Beit Hanashim. He would go in front of the courtyard of the harem. That is on our map. The courtyard of the harem is number 11. He would go over here. He would go round. So he'd walk around the outside to number 11. He'd shout up, Esther, Esther. And some eunuch would look down and go, hello. High voice for eunuch. Hello, I'll get Esther. And Mordechai would talk to Esther. We know where they were. We know where things took place. Room by room. The entire story can be mapped. And you know what's so interesting? What's the other great palace that takes place in the Torah that we mention over and over again? Moses. When Moses goes to visit Pharaoh, each time in his palace, for 13 chapters, the beginning of Exodus, we also have a great palace. But there's no mention of the palace. It just says Moshe went to see Pharaoh. It doesn't mention the front, the inner court, the outer court, nothing. We get no description of any construction in Exodus chapter 1 to 13. But the Purim Megillah is full of it. The palace plays a role in the story. It's about the corridors of power. Let me show you 2 examples that will end. Look at this. In the opening bit, it says the part, where did the party take place? In chapter 1, verse 5. It took place b'chatzer ginat bitan hamelach. They had a great and small 7 days of partying in the courtyard of the garden of the king's palace. Where's that? Where is the courtyard of the garden of the king's palace? On my map, there's 3 different places. The courtyard is one place, the garden is one place, and the palace is one place. Well, look what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, you're right. Shmuel and Rav debated. Those worthy went to the courtyard, the more worthy went to the garden, and those more worthy went to the palace. Because it was an open season. They opened the whole palace, and if you were 1 level, you got to go to 3. If you're more wealthy, you got to 6. And if you weren't, you go to the gardens over here, number 13. So literally, the way the Gemara describes the palace is what it looks like on the map. And at the very end of the story, what does it happen at the end of the story? With this, I really will end. Remember where Esther finally has a private party? She holds a private party, Beit Mishter, in the king's chambers. And she finally says to the king, remember it's just her and Haman and Achashverosh. And he says to the king, my people are being attacked. And the king goes, you've got a people I never knew. Because until then, as I told you, she had just become Princess of Persia. We don't want to know about her background. We prefer, because once you've got a background that's political, that can destabilize the empire, because they could be fighting each other. So Achashverosh wants to get rid of this. He wants to be nice to her. He goes, and what's happened? She goes, well, there's someone trying to kill my people. Kill your people? Who is it? And she goes, it's Haman. And what does the king do when he's upset? Look what it says. It says, Esther accuses Haman. What happened? The king gets up in his anger, from the party. And what does he do? He goes for a walk. El Ginat ginat habita, and he goes to walk in the palace garden. So look over here. We can go up. We can actually see where the palace garden is. He was over here having the party in number 7, and he walked along this corridor here, along here into the garden to calm down. Right, looking at trees calmed him down. And then when he came back again, what happened? Haman was pleading with Esther, and he jumped her. And Achashverosh goes, "What, you trying to rape my wife now?" And Haman got taken away and killed. And Esther got treated nicely. And Mordechai, her uncle, got given a role. Why? Because Achashverosh wants to keep Esther happy, because he wants to keep the symbol of Persia in good nick. And that's why it happens. So you can see, you can retrace the story over here. When I taught this to some elementary school Jewish studies teachers, one of them was amazing. In the gym in his school, a week before Purim, with sticky tape, he laid out this palace on the floor and got the children to enact the entire Megillah, room by room, as laid out on this palace. So just to finish off, I was showing you that you can actually map the Megillah, and it brings it to life, and it becomes a story in the corridors of power. And the decision for the future of the Jewish people was done by a beautiful young woman and her uncle, who through manipulation along the corridors of power in this great palace could save their people. The palace of Susa, the palace of Shushan, from King Xerxes 2,500 years ago, as described in Herodotus, in excavations in Susa, and exactly the same in our Megillah. Thank you very much. There we go. Now we've got time, I think, for some questions.
Thank you.
Look at the chat.
Yeah, well,
okay,
I'll thank you,
yes.
and I'll facilitate a few things. But first of all, thank you, and what a great way to prepare for Purim. And when we read the Megillah, hopefully people will read it in a different way this time, from your sharing. So that was excellent. People have asked about the handout, and I put it quite a few times in the chat, so you could download it from the chat. But everybody will get a copy of it by tomorrow, so you'll have the whole detailed handout, and you can use it as you see fit. And this
there's a question of who authored. Someone says who authored
right.
the Megillah. So just to mention, that was traditionally it was done by Mordechai, who writes the Megillah. He writes it down, but you could argue that it was written slightly later, definitely by a Jew who'd either visited the palace, had definitely visited the palace of Shushan, and knew the life of Achashverosh Xerxes. There's no doubt about it. They knew it. Whether we can never prove it all happened, we don't know. When Xerxes came back from his battles, he married a woman called a mistis in the Greek. Is a mistis Esther? Maybe, we don't know.
There is a tomb in Hamadan, right? Hamdan.
That's right. That's right.
Of Esther and Mordechai, and people don't know how old it is, but it's been dated back maybe to the 14th century, 16th century.
That's right. It could be them there, and every year they would read the Megillah there as well, and memorialize Esther and Mordechai. Absolutely, but we don't know if they're really buried there.
Something you may not know, but my friend Rabbi Charlie found out. Apparently, when people would go visit or still visit the tomb of Esther and Mordechai, you're supposed to bow down in there at least twice, which is ironic. Just so you know, handout.
Yeah. Yes, because Haman wouldn't bow down. Exactly.
Yes. So another question that came up twice, people were very upset about how we know that Vashti was killed because it's not in the text of the Megillah.
Right. Maybe she wasn't killed. And this is the key, by the way, but she shamed the king. So Achashverosh, Xerxes, has a problem on his hands. On one hand, he needs her to keep the Babylonians under wraps, control. But then she shamed him, which he can't handle either. So he gets rid of her. Whether she was killed, which some commentaries say, or she was just put into the harem that I showed you, room 8, never to be seen again, and hidden there, who knows? But he needed a new symbol. Don't think about what happened to her. Think of the politics. It's a political challenge that he needs. She's not acting in a way that looks good. Lahavdil, just like, I'm trying to be modern with you, we got rid of Meghan, right? Didn't kill her, we just got rid of her. She's not an HRH or Her Royal Highness anymore. She's gone off to America. She's not really part of the royal family anymore. She's there, but she's a bit too difficult, so we concentrate on Kate. That's what royals do. If people don't play ball, they don't give the image that's needed to unify the empire, we just get rid of them. Right? So he retired her. Whether she died or not, that's not the point. But he needs to replace her, and that's what the whole of chapter 2 is all about. Princesses from all over the country. Also, by the way, do you understand what princesses from women from all over the country does? It unifies the nation. Anybody could be the wife of Achashverosh. Therefore, everybody feels connected. You see? It's very clever. Right? The whole thing is about soft power.
Do you think so? But we've all been brought up to think of Achashverosh as a stupid dolt of a king, of a leader. But it would seem that that's exactly not correct. And then second, the story about Xerxes being Achashverosh, is that a common, I mean, is this commonly accepted analysis?
It's common. So Mitchell First, who was a YU graduate and did his PhD on the subject, published a book about the Jewish history and conflict, where he looked at the different debates of who was Xerxes and Achashverosh, and he argues this, and he lists all the rabbis that go according to the strict reading of the Talmud, all the modern ones, all the ones in between. So for those who've looked at the archaeology, this is the main approach that makes the most sense. Yes, the archaeologists do. Ultra-Orthodox don't reject this because they want it to make it earlier, and they have to go and twist and turns to make it an earlier king, Cambyses, which doesn't work for me at all. The most likely one, as I said, is Xerxes. Is the approach that I'm giving you.
And then the question about his intelligence. What was Xerxes like?
Versus right. Interesting, by the way, right? I mean, I can quote you from the handout. I'll read you about Xerxes. Remember, because he loses his battles. It was in that. Yeah, I'll show you on the handout. Let's have a look. Over here. And actually describes, I've got a quote from that book about him. Let's see it over here. Here we go. And just, Ari, do you mind reading out so I can conserve my voice a bit? Here we go. What was he like? What was he like? Do you want to read that out, Ari?
Sure. Who was Xerxes? What was he like? Xerxes, who ruled the Persian Empire from 486 to 465 BC, has largely had a bad press from history, and even worse from the moralists. He is remembered mainly as the king who failed to conquer Greece, the villain of a heroic story of resistance. The memory is a partial one, and Xerxes should equally be recognized for his achievements. He reigned for 20 years, crushed several provincial revolts, bequeathed to his heirs an empire whose boundaries were to remain stable for almost 150 years, and brought to a conclusion, apart from the minor later additions, one of the greatest building projects of antiquity, the imperial city of Persepolis, which I believe we have people online who've been there, who spent time in Persepolis.
Right. And Persepolis and Susa are very similar in terms of their layouts with the hall of columns. Carry on.
Because our surviving early sources are Greek, primarily Aeschylus. Aeschylus's play.
Sorry, I jumped. So 1 second, I'll get back to you again. Aeschylus is the playwright, yes. So let me just get back to that. Here we go. Yeah, go
on. Because our surviving early sources are Greek, primarily Aeschylus's play, the Persians, and Herodotus's histories, written by denizens of the little country that defeated the great empire, the view we have inherited is of Xerxes as a failure, and his failure was clearly a result not only of moral inadequacies in the king himself, but of structural ones in the empire he ruled.
Okay, so he's seen in that negative light. I'm going to suggest that it's a halfway house. If you're not a great political strategist, soft power is all about image. It's all about making yourself up. Now, this is a foreign idea for you Americans, the idea of a leader who isn't so smart, but is really good at rallies and PR and just says what everybody wants to hear to keep all the different factions together. That's a foreign idea for you Americans. You probably can't imagine a leader like that. But imagine a leader like that. And people say, is he smart? Is he not smart? How come everybody loves him so much? Right? How does he manage to do all this? When you're into soft power and populism, it's not about intelligence. It's about, well, not necessarily even charisma. It's just about being popular. And you say whatever it is to make everybody happy, to give them what they want. And that is the kind of leadership that he did. A little bit of relevance to today, I would say, without betraying any politics. I hope that was a clean enough answer for all of you.
Thank you. We try not to get into too much politics at CSP, but we do appreciate history, and we do appreciate rereading our texts and thinking about them in a new way. And we look forward to seeing you with a group of people reading the Megillah on location. So hopefully within a year or so.
I might have to tell you a little story. Can I tell you a lovely story about this? If you've got a couple of minutes, I'll tell you an amazing story about this. So I've given the tour in the museum, as I've shown you many, many times, okay, to all different kinds of Jews. But once I got phoned by Lubavitch Rebbetzin in January, and she said, Rabbi Zarum, I'd like to give you a tour for my shul of 50 older people. It's a small community in South London. Could you please give the tour? I said, yes, when? She goes, I want you to do it on Purim. I said, I can't do it on Purim because I've got to hear the Megillah in shul, and I've got to have my meal. She goes, no, don't worry. We're reading the Megillah in the British Museum. And I said, well, I told you this story before because you're nodding. I said to her,
I read about it. I read about it online. Go ahead.
All right. I said, there's no way you're going to be allowed to do this. She said, so I learned never underestimate a Lubavitch Rebbetzin. She phoned at the museum. She managed to press 4 for the funding. So she spoke to the finance people. She managed to talk to the professor. And in the bowels of the museum, outside the great lecture hall, is a foyer. And it's so large that 50 people could sit there and read a Megillah. And she organized it. So on Purim morning, I came out of shul, dressed obviously as Indiana Jones, with my hat and my whip. And I went on the train with my whip, and I turned up at the museum, and there they were, all 50, with a scroll out in the British Museum, reading the Megillah. Amazing, right? And then we had a little lunch, and then we went upstairs into that room that I showed you, room 52, and I gave the tour on Purim. And at the end of it, I turned to the Lubavitch rabbi and I said, "You're Lubavitch?" He said, "Yes." I said, "We need to dance." So we danced in a circle around the Cyrus cylinder and sang just for a couple of minutes till they shouted at us to stop it. But it thought it would be a fun thing to do. So that's what we actually did once on Purim itself in that room. It was a great memory. Can I just briefly mention, Ari, what I'm doing at the college?
Sure.
And then, right, so
we'll
just briefly, if you're interested, and then we'll wrap up, is that obviously go to Ari's things, but Ari said I should mention what I do. So I teach at a college, the London School of Jewish Studies, LSJS. The website's on the handout, and we have lots of online stuff. But what might interest you is on Monday nights at the moment. Every fortnight, we're having another one of Rabbi Sachs's students. There's about 30 or 40 of us from around the world who are giving a lecture on another part of his philosophy every 2 weeks. Last night, we had Professor Sam Liebens, who you really should get, Ari, by the way, from Haifa University, talking about one part of his philosophy. And in 2 weeks' time, we've got Tanya White doing it. So that's every 2 weeks. And in the alternative weeks, I and a big rabbi from London called Rabbi Joseph Dweck, who's the head of the Spanish and Portuguese community, we analyze another one of the 10 commandments every week. So this Monday night, we're going to be doing the third commandment about not lying, about not saying God's name in vain. So if you're interested in what we do at LSJS, you can register and you can see the kind of programs that we do as well. So you can do learning wherever you want, but no obligation. Keep with Ari. It's a great program that you have here. So again, thank you so much. Sorry that I spoke a bit fast and we covered a lot of stuff, but I hope it's got you ready to have an enlightening and a fun Megillah and Purim this Thursday night. Thank you.
Most definitely. I'm looking forward to having you back March 16th to talk about the life and thought of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. So hopefully everybody will join us. And I think we're going to visit the Sistine Chapel with you maybe in a few weeks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A rabbi in the Vatican. That's the first. Rabbi
in the Vatican. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Rabbi Zarum, for joining us from the UK. And everybody, happy Purim. Remember, we have another Purim program with Mark Michael Epstein coming up. He'll actually read the
wonderful.
So Mark will read the, he gets very upset because he sees that I put in my notes like professor this, rabbi this, but I just say Mark Michael. But we all know him as Mark Michael because he's been here for a month. But Professor Epstein will be talking about a new Megillah that he's been working on, like from an artistic perspective, but he'll also be reading some lines of the Megillah from different tropes and from different parts of the Jewish world. So that will be 5 p.m. our time Pacific. Hopefully you'll join us, and keep safe, be safe, and looking forward to having you back. CSP.
Wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.
Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Neil, good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you. Bye.